Très heureux et donc doublement fier et heureux de représenter le comité des partenaires et donc leur contribution pour cette formidable initiative publique-privée et également donc d'être là avec Dr Sean Cousin. Et il nous a paru intéressant avec Marco et les organisateurs de la journée de venir faire intervenir Sean en sa qualité de triple casquette dans la santé. Donc d'une part la casquette de régulateur, car pendant 10 ans, il a été à la FDA, donc la Food and Drug Administration, qui est l'autorité de régulation du médicament aux États-Unis, et notamment à des postes qui nous concernent directement, l'OCE, l'Oncology Center Excellence. Donc il a regardé les évaluations des premières thérapies d'immuno-oncologie, des thérapies cellulaires géniques que vous connaissez. Et également aussi, je crois très très intéressant pour le débat d'aujourd'hui, un des fondateurs d'une organisation qui s'appelle Informed, qui justement s'est préoccupé des soucis d'interopérabilité des données cliniques à des usages secondaires. Donc on est complètement dans le sujet. Ça, c'est sa première casquette. Ça prend un peu de temps, mais il a une expérience tellement riche. La deuxième, c'était le patron mondial d'innovation chez Johnson & Johnson, donc également une casquette industrielle. Et enfin, une casquette académique médicale, car j'ai oublié de dire que Sean était, est toujours d'ailleurs un oncologue. Il a été aussi président de CancerLink, qui est le registre que vous connaissez, certains d'entre vous, de l'ASCO, donc de l'American Society of Clinical Oncology. Voilà, et donc très très heureux de faire intervenir. Thank you, Sean, for making the trip. Et peut-être juste avant de laisser la parole à Sean, on a beaucoup parlé d'accès en fait, de la difficulté. Alors c'est toujours un verre à moitié plein, certains étaient très optimistes et certains un peu plus pessimistes. Et aux États-Unis, bien sûr, les choses sont loin d'être idéales. Mais peut-être dans cet esprit de benchmarking, qui est, je crois, une excellente idée de manière générale. Il y a plusieurs sources de données, en fait, données vie réelles aux États-Unis. Une des premières, c'est bien sûr toutes les données publiques. Donc, en fait, les recherches, les registres, si vous voulez, qui ont été financés par l'argent public. Donc, je pense au National Institutes of Health, une base qui est très, très connue, qui est la base DBGAP, une base publique, qui contient des données très, très riches de phénotypes et également des données moléculaires, donc au mix. Et à titre d'exemple, donc en 6 semaines, si vous vous débrouillez bien, vous avez accès en fait aux données brutes. Donc il suffit d'écrire un protocole sur quelle est votre question de recherche, comment vous allez traiter la donnée, donner des assurances bien sûr sur la sécurité des données, la non-réidentification, et puis passer devant un comité éthique. Et donc une fois que vous avez l'approbation, donc c'est des études non interventionnelles, donc ça va vite. En 6 semaines, vous pouvez avoir accès à cette donnée. Et le seul coût, c'est le coût finalement du comité éthique, qui est autour de $2000. Donc pour les startups, c'est tout à fait intéressant pour développer justement des modèles IA. Deuxième source aussi, là un modèle qui est assez intéressant, c'est le modèle finalement de marketplace. Et vous avez des acteurs, donc des gens comme Health Verity ou Datavant, qui contractent en fait avec des sources de données. Donc ça peut être des assureurs, vous savez que c'est un système d'assureurs privé aux États-Unis, des chaînes de pharmacie comme CVS, des labos d'analyse comme Quest, des hôpitaux. Et finalement, ces sources de données mettent leurs données sur une place de marché. Vous, par exemple, en tant qu'industriel ou chercheur, vous allez constituer votre cohorte. Il y a des très beaux outils finalement pour qualifier quelles sont les sources qui sont pertinentes pour répondre à votre donnée de recherche. Il vous donne finalement le nombre de patients qui permet de répondre qui permet d'être constitué dans la cohorte, et un mécanisme qui s'appelle la tokenisation, que vous connaissez certainement, qui consiste en fait, pour simplifier, à prendre le nom, prénom, le zip code, donc le code postal du patient, le genre, la date de naissance aussi, je crois. Ça crée en fait une clé non réversible. Il balade ça dans les différentes sources et ça permet de chaîner finalement longitudinalement toutes ces sources de données. Et ça, c'est pas mal. Alors bien sûr, le côté désavantageux, c'est commercial. Donc vous devez payer la source de données pour abattre les données. Mais c'est aussi un moyen intéressant d'accéder à des données multimodales très riches. Et puis enfin, la possibilité finalement de compter sur le patient lui-même pour demander en fait à l'hôpital une copie électronique de ses dossiers médicaux. Donc ça, c'est un droit finalement qui est aux États-Unis. Et donc les hôpitaux ont été contraints quelque part, parce que vous savez, certains hôpitaux ont tendance plutôt à s'asseoir sur leurs données, à libérer, à fournir ce qu'on appelle des API, des interfaces en fait, informatiques pour rapatrier la donnée du patient. Et nous-mêmes, par exemple, notre société, on est connecté à 60 000 hôpitaux. Et donc on peut ramener des données cliniques extrêmement riches donc, pour des cas d'usage qu'on a discuté aujourd'hui. Voilà, donc c'est pas parfait, mais effectivement, il y a un accès qui est assez riche finalement aux États-Unis et qui permet finalement d'essayer certains cas d'usage et de faire des retours d'expérience. Voilà, donc voilà pour l'accès. Et je vais maintenant laisser la parole à Sean. On va passer en anglais. And perhaps, Sean, the first question in terms of the use cases for world data in the United States, and perhaps particularly from the regulator, the FDA's perspective. How you generate evidence, for what, with what purpose, and so on. Well, thank you, Sean.
Sure. Thank you, Robert, and thanks for the great introduction. I hope that wasn't all about me. That was quite a long introduction. Real-world evidence has been quite a buzz, as they say, in the United States for some time, and maybe I can provide a little bit of historical perspective in terms of how it came about in the United States. Back in 2008, the National Academies of Medicine, which is a non-governmental organization that several years ago, it's been around for 100 years or so, was authorized by Congress to make policy recommendations as an independent nonprofit entity to government agencies on issues of critical importance in science, medicine, and engineering. And in 2008, they convened a number of meetings. And the idea at the time was that we're moving in a direction where we're going to have electronic means of capturing data at the point of care, electronic health records. And back then in the United States, the technologies were still in the early stages. However, the idea at the time was, can we envision a world where the data that we collect at the point of care electronically can actually inform us about treatment decisions in terms of providing evidence that we typically have to rely on clinical trials. So they coined the term at the time, the learning health system. And I don't know if that translates into a lot of some of the work on electronic health records that folks have been talking about today. But that learning health system, meaning a healthcare system that learns as it provides routine care. Because the only way traditionally that we learn in medicine is to do clinical trials, studies outside of the organic and the established framework where we deliver care. And there are issues actually with that. There are fundamental issues with clinical trials, and one of them is that they don't always translate well to the clinic. So that learning health system became a call to action, and this is 2008, after the report was published. And a number of people who were part of the meeting, there were policy folks, there were entrepreneurs, there were some investors. So it became an aspirational goal. And there were a lot of experimentations early on, a lot of failed experimentations. But then the United States issued a piece of legislation that mandated all physicians to adopt electronic health records. And this was around 2008 or so. Unfortunately, it was a little rushed, so the implementation was not optimal. However, today, nearly all physicians and health systems have an electronic health record. And because of the ethos that were expressed by the National Academies, it really essentially created a lot of activity in terms of making investments in aggregating the data, curating it, and trying to learn from it. The FDA in the early days was really not in the picture, and biopharma was not in the picture. In fact, early on, a lot of the discussions around real-world evidence and the learning health system was from the perspective of payers. It was the payers that were the most interested in the data in the United States. For example, CMS, which is the federal entity that outside of the private health insurance system was very much at the table from day one, and then private insurers started to address and influence the process. And the idea at the time was that, well, this data at the point of care can inform value-based decisions. and paying for performance and quality of care. So in the United States, the electronic health records evolved around these payment schemas. And for a variety of different reasons, the idea of defining and extracting value out of the point of care using electronic health records didn't come to fruition. And later on, many years later, biopharma and clinical researchers became interested. Obviously, in clinical research, there is a long history of observational studies, chart reviews. If you're a medical resident or fellow, you rely on doing chart reviews for your research. So that muscle memory was there. And as the medical profession, outside of the payers and the payment system, and biopharma started to get involved, that's when things, I believe, got very interesting. And that's when FDA started to think about real-world evidence. And one realization early on, as the medical field started to, and the medical research ecosystem started to look at the data and engage with these electronic health systems, it became very clear that there are a lot of deficiencies. Again, going back to the fact that in the early days, they were based around billing and payment schemas, not necessarily clinically meaningful variables. And there were a number of changes that the central authorities made in the United States to make the data more clinically relevant, and that's something that still continues. But when the FDA became interested, it became quite a dynamic ecosystem because all of a sudden you had an incentive for private capital to pour into the space and make the data better and fit for purpose beyond its original intended use, which was clinical care, maybe payment decisions. And those private investments really looked at the FDA to provide guidance. Is the data acceptable? And so there were a lot of debates at the time. And frankly, FDA didn't know exactly what to do. There were a lot of champions at the FDA at the time, and we participated a lot in open forums, discussions with academics, the technology industry, biopharma, and there were a lot of lessons that were learned. And this became a very dynamic milieu. A lot of investments, again, went into startups that were able to gather data, curate and clean up the data. And then this reached the ears of Congress. And it wasn't until Congress stepped in that it really became real, and FDA got really involved. It went from FDA being very interested and intrigued to having a mandate from Congress that FDA has to develop a framework and a number of guidances. And this was a piece of legislation in 2016 called the 21st Century Cures Act. I believe, unless my Google translator was hallucinating, I believe this came up earlier today. And the 21st Century Cures Act is a magnificent piece of legislation because it's highly technical. And it was one of the first times that Congress really immersed itself in the language and the culture of technology and innovation and reflected it. In fact, if you look at the legislation, there are specifications about application programming interfaces, APIs. Imagine that in a piece of legislation. And that basically was a new beginning for the FDA, and FDA started to develop a framework and a number of guidances from then on. So just a historical perspective, and as we all know, that really enabled an ecosystem of entrepreneurs and investors to really put private capital into this space.
Perhaps you could give a few examples of kind of regulatory evaluation of real-world data as part of, nothing confidential, obviously, but maybe which
Sure,
use
yeah,
cases?
absolutely.
And we talked about synthetic control arm and things like that, so.
So we start to do a lot of thinking at the FDA about use cases, and for a number of reasons, because it's the use cases we believe that would teach everyone, industry, the technology community, the investors who have their capital on the line, and also the FDA, who would need to develop a framework. One of the things that FDA didn't want to do at the time was to make top-down decisions that could have unintended consequences. So it really opened its ears, and we really wanted to hear from stakeholders to identify use cases. So everything that was mentioned today started to bubble up, external control arms. And there were a couple of scenarios where we thought they represented low-hanging fruits. One is indication expansion. Once you have a therapy on the market and it's already been approved, then if you want to extend the indication to a different population, we already know about the safety of the drug. So real-world evidence can play a critical role in bringing the evidence needed for the FDA to expand the indication, potentially without the need to do any clinical trials. And that became one of the low-hanging fruits. And this is public information, and so Pfizer, in collaboration with Flatiron, which was one of the first companies that was founded by a young entrepreneur who got funding from Google Ventures and several other larger technology companies to extract oncology data from the point of care, paired up with Pfizer. And they found a very interesting indication for this use case. And this was for palbociclib. So palbociclib is a cancer drug that the FDA and EMA had approved for female breast cancer. And we noticed, the FDA noticed, and so did Pfizer and Flatiron, that oncologists in the United States are using palbociclib not just in females, but also in males, because there are really no options when it comes to male breast cancer. So Pfizer, Flatiron, and they came to us at the FDA and they said, well, if we work with Flatiron to get data on the experience of male patients who are getting palbociclib, would that be enough? And we didn't say no, we didn't say yes. We said it's a review issue. I don't know, for those of you that are in this world, it may make some companies, drives them crazy when you say it's a review issue. That means let's just wait and see. And they compiled the data and they submitted it to the FDA. Now, maybe this is a time to sort of talk about some of the complexities that the FDA faced, because it was really the first time that FDA wanted to make a regulatory decision. So Pfizer and Flatiron, as the partner, had a number of meetings with us at the FDA, and the reviewers were didn't really necessarily know what to do with the data because they hadn't really reviewed real-world data. So for a number of months, there were multiple meetings, and the reviewers were basically opining on data quality, data integrity, how to ensure all of those very important metrics to have confidence in the data. And obviously, study design. The reviewers at the FDA, at the EMA, all health authorities, the reviewers are very good when it comes to assessing study designs. But there was a bottleneck, and we couldn't figure out how do we determine if the data is of high quality and integrity. To make a long story short, we sort of start to think about clinical trials. How does Health Canada, how does EMA, Health Japan, the FDA, how do they assess data quality and integrity? When we conduct a registrational phase 3 study, We submit it to EMA, to the FDA. How do they ensure the data has quality? What's the standard? And because there's always noisiness, even in registrational studies. So we dug into that, and we realized that, well, it's partly procedural and partly, actually, I should say it's mostly procedural. There's no statistical magic that you can apply to the data. What do I mean by that? At the most fundamental level, there's a paragraph that's an attestation that sponsors send to the FDA. And it says that we conducted this clinical trial in accordance to good clinical practice guidelines. So that's an attestation that we crossed all the T's, dotted all the I's. And then we have the Office of Scientific Investigations. Similar thing applies to EMA, that do site visits, clinical inspections. What do? They look at source document, and they're looking for fraud. If you look at the results of every single clinical site inspection, there's always discrepancies. There's, for example, blood pressure was 140/90 on this visit, but then the data that EMA or FDA gets, it's something else, it's 200/100. Now, these things happen, even in clinical trials. But if there's no fraud, then we can deal with that. We can do sensitivity analyses. And if you ask yourselves or your regulatory colleagues, at what level of discrepancy do you lose data integrity for a clinical trial? There is no answer to that. It's a subjective, procedural process. And then obviously there's some statistical work that we do. If a site has too many discrepancies, we exclude it. We run the results to see if we get different results, like a sensitivity analysis. But for the most part, as long as there's no fraud, a little bit of noisiness is okay. So we basically applied the same concept to real-world data. We brought in the Office of Scientific Investigations, and we said, just check the source data, see if it matches. And that reshaped FDA's thinking, and it was reflected actually in a number of guidances that FDA issued. And that was basically the journey of the FDA to really figure out a way to manage and understand real-world data.
All right, thank you so much. I think we're running out of time, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the exciting and insightful presentation, Sean. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.